Walt Rourke thought he'd seen it all, until his old Chevy truck vanished without a trace one crisp September morning. The air had just started to turn, that gentle kind of cool that tugged at your sleeves as if reminding you summer had said its goodbye. Walt stood on his front porch with a steaming mug in hand, scanning the driveway where his 1989 Silverado usually slept. Only now, there was nothing. Just an oil stain in the gravel and the flutter of a curled paper barely clinging to the screen door. He set his mug on the porch rail, plucked the paper free, and squinted. Vehicle removal notice, in blocky letters. Below that, a stamped emblem from the Newfield Homeowners Association, and a brief message claiming the truck violated Article 14B, Section 9, non-compliant parking. No warning. No chance to move it. No signature either. He leaned against the porch column, jaw flexing. This wasn't the first time Deborah had flexed her power, but it was certainly the boldest. Just last week, at the HOA's monthly gathering in the rec hall, she'd said something that clung to his memory now like a burr. Not everyone gets special treatment, she'd remarked, looking right at him as he asked why lawn ornaments suddenly counted as clutter. He folded the paper, tucked it into his jacket, and headed down the sidewalk, cane tapping gently against the pavement. It was still early, but the Bluebird Diner would be open, and he needed answers, or at least a hot plate of eggs. The bell over the diner door jingled softly. Inside, it smelled like hash browns, bacon grease, and a hint of cinnamon. The booths near the window were already occupied by the regulars, Mrs. Tucker from Maple Lane, Ed with the Red Sox cap, and two women in cardigans knitting across steaming mugs. "Morning, Walt," called May from behind the counter. "Coffee and your usual?" He nodded, sliding onto the stool. "Make it 2 eggs scrambled today, not 3. Don't feel up for a full breakfast." May raised an eyebrow. "You sick?" "No," he said, voice low. "The truck's gone. Towed. No notice. Just a paper stuck to my door like some kind of eviction." A hush fell near him. Ed leaned closer from his booth. "Don't tell me it's that Langley woman again." "She's making her rounds," May muttered. "2 doors down from me, someone got cited for a crack in their garden gnome." Walt let out a short breath. Since when does neighborhood pride mean sneaking around at night and tagging folks with warnings? "Since she got re-elected," someone mumbled from the corner. As he ate slowly, savoring each bite more for the routine than the taste, the door opened and in came Benji, backpack slung over one shoulder, skateboard in hand. "Sir," he greeted with a respectful nod, voice still in that uncertain pitch between boy and man. Walt smiled faintly. "Benji. You skipping school to see me?" "No, sir. On my way. Just, my dad got something too." "An envelope." "No name, just the HOA seal. Said our mailbox was too far from the curb." Walt set his fork down. "That's absurd. They've lived there 20 years. Benji shrugged. "He's fixing it today. Didn't want to cause trouble." Walt looked out the window, watching a bird hop along the sidewalk. Something in his chest stirred, a mix of frustration and resolve. The town was changing, word spread faster than morning mist, Deborah had crossed a line, and Newfield knew it. At the library that Thursday morning, the smell of dust, paper, and lemon polish mixed in the quiet air. Walt Rourke sat at one of the back tables with a stack of binders and a yellow pad in front of him. His Marine Corps jacket lay draped on the chair behind him, the elbows of his flannel shirt faded from years of leaning into work. He flipped a page in the HOA manual, underlining passages and making neat copies of articles onto his notepad. Section 9, 7-day notice, visual standard, nothing about gravel being grounds for immediate tow, he mumbled. The librarian, a soft-spoken woman in her 60s, occasionally peeked over her glasses at him with curiosity. Walt nodded once to acknowledge her, then went back to copying. Every word he transcribed was an affirmation that what had happened wasn't just wrong, it was against the very rules Deborah claimed to uphold. On his way out, he passed Mrs. Rinaldi near the checkout desk. Her arms were full of children's books and construction paper. "Morning, Walt," she said warmly. I heard about your truck. I'm so sorry. He gave her a tired smile. Thanks, Alma. Didn't expect to become the talk of the town. She hesitated. I didn't want to say anything, but, my granddaughter? The little one who draws hopscotch on our sidewalk. We got fined. Defacing community pathways. Walt blinked. For sidewalk chalk. She nodded. It rained 2 days later. Was gone before the ink dried on the citation. He shook his head slowly. That's not enforcement, that's pettiness. Walt limped slightly as he crossed Maple Street toward the square. Autumn leaves skated across the pavement, catching on the edge of his boots. Newfield had always taken pride in its simplicity. The people here weren't flashy, they were folks who fixed their own fences, cooked in batches, and remembered birthdays with handwritten cards. The town square was already filling up with folding chairs and coffee cups. Thursday afternoons often brought neighbors together for catch-ups and swap meets, but today, the air buzzed with something else. Mayor Holloway stood near the war memorial, dressed in jeans and a soft blue pullover. He smiled when he saw Walt and raised a paper cup in greeting. Heard about your truck, the mayor said, then sighed. Deborah's getting a lot of calls this week. Walt glanced around. And you? You plan on doing anything about it? Holloway winced slightly. The HOA operates independently. You know how it is, they have their board, their power. But I'll admit, it feels like she's gone a bit overboard lately. That's one way to put it, Walt replied. Another way is she's forgetting who this town belongs to. From a nearby bench, 2 older women nodded in agreement. One of them leaned over and whispered something to the other, pointing subtly toward Walt. A little later, a soft-spoken man in suspenders shared how his wife had been warned about her potted marigolds being unapproved flora. Another woman recounted a $25 fine for drying laundry on her porch. The stories flowed like a quiet stream, not angry, just heavy with disappointment. Walt listened more than he spoke, but when he did speak, his words were careful. If you've got time this Sunday morning, he told them, I'll be out on my porch. Thought I might read a few rules out loud. Might help if others heard them too. They chuckled, but several nodded. Walt didn't press further. As the sun began to dip, casting long amber shadows on the sidewalk, he returned to the Bluebird Diner with a copy of the notice that had been left on his door and the specific clause from the handbook that proved it invalid. May gave him a look as he stepped in, and he simply tapped the paper to the bulletin board near the back window. Community information was written in faded Sharpie across the top. Below it, flyers for lost cats and piano lessons fluttered. Walt pinned his page with a silver thumbtack and stepped back. A few patrons noticed and got up to read. One man scratched his chin. Didn't know they had to give notice. They do, Walt said plainly. Says so right here. The diner grew quiet again. A calm kind of quiet, as though something real had been planted. As Walt leaves the diner, Deborah watches from across the street, phone in hand. They called it F coffee talk, but by noon, half the street was quoting bylaws like lawyers. Sunday morning unfolded with the lazy charm of a southern hymn. Walt's front lawn had never seen so many folding chairs. A weathered card table stood between his porch steps and the open garage, bearing a mismatched army of mugs, thermoses, and store-bought muffins, all carefully arranged by Mrs. Rinaldi and Benji's father. The aroma of cinnamon and brewed coffee floated through the air, tangled with the crisp scent of cut grass and the soft, steady tone of a violin practicing in the distance. Walt stood beside the garage door, where his battered cord jacket hung on a nail just beneath the American flag. He'd rolled up his sleeves and pushed his reading glasses down his nose, a stack of copied bylaws fanned across a metal tray like playing cards. Take one if you haven't, he said, lifting his chin as another neighbor ambled up. We'll get started in just a minute. Benji ran an extension cord to a small speaker, the kind used for school announcements. Walt tapped it once to test, no static. He glanced across the yard. Mrs. Rinaldi chatted with an older couple from 2 blocks over. Benji's dad sipped quietly by the hedges. The mayor hadn't shown, but Walt hadn't expected him to. And under the maple tree, half hidden by her curls, little Lily moved her bow across the strings with delicate precision. "Before we begin," Walt said finally, raising his voice just above the hum of chatter, "just want to say thanks. This isn't a rebellion. It's not a protest. It's neighbors reading fine print." That earned a chuckle. He held up a sheaf of stapled papers. 7 citations this past month. No prior notice. No photographs. No signatures from more than one board member. That's not how this is supposed to work. A woman in sunglasses raised her hand. "They told me my porch planter was an eyesore. Gave me 48 hours. I was out of town. They fined my brother for leaving a fishing pole on the lawn," someone else said. Walt nodded, flipping through his notes. According to Article 4, subsection B, any infraction must be documented, signed by 2 board members, and delivered with a 7-day notice. Deborah's flyers? They're missing half of that. Benji's father stepped forward. "So, what do we do? File separate complaints?" Walt shook his head. Too slow. Too easy to brush aside. But a group complaint, signed, notarized, referencing their own handbook? That's harder to ignore. And if we do it publicly, respectfully, it carries weight. He turned toward the makeshift table and held up a printed form. "Benji's dad here works for the Postal Service. He's agreed to help us organize a submission, every citation you've got, scanned, with notes. I'll compile the legal comparisons." More heads nodded. Someone clapped. Not loudly, but with the rhythm of agreement. Meanwhile, Lily continued to play under the tree, soft notes floating like distant church bells. Her father stood nearby, arms crossed. When Walt caught his eye, the man gave a slight nod, as if to say thank you. Walt motioned for silence. "One more thing. This isn't about revenge. Deborah isn't the enemy. The real problem is when rules serve power instead of fairness." Mrs. Rinaldi added gently, "That's what made this town special. We looked after each other. We didn't just enforce rules, we lived them." The quiet that followed was heavy with recognition. Walt placed his papers back on the table. "We'll file Monday. But today, we gather. We talk. We take our time." Lily stopped playing and looked up, curious, as if sensing a shift in the wind. Walt caught her gaze and smiled. Back in the garage, the screen of Walt's old flip phone lit up. He flipped it open, thumb pressed firmly on the worn-down button. A text pops on Walt's flip phone, "We're in. Marines don't forget. But not for the better. And not for the fair." Later that afternoon, back on his porch with a second cup of coffee, Walt retrieved the HOA handbook from the shelf inside his foyer. It still smelled like the box it came in, dust and printer ink. He flipped through the pages, finger running down each regulation until he found it. Section 9. There it was. Vehicles may not be parked on gravel unless compliant with visual standards. Enforcement action requires written notice and a minimum 7-day correction period. He read the line again, slower this time. No such notice had come. No 7 days. No phone call, no email. Just the paper taped to the screen this morning. The breeze picked up, rustling the dry leaves on his porch. Walt looked up toward the street, then back down at the passage. "I think they broke their own rule," Walt mutters, reaching for his old Marine Corps notepad. On Monday morning, not a single trash bin stood at the curb, and Deborah noticed. She stood at the edge of Oak Ridge Drive in her pressed beige pantsuit, clipboard hugged tight to her chest, mouth slightly open as her eyes moved from house to house. Not one bin in sight. It was trash day, and the usual row of green plastic sentinels was conspicuously absent. Walt Rourke watched from behind his lace curtain. His living room was quiet except for the tick of a wall clock and the soft rustle of morning wind against the porch awning. He sipped black coffee from a heavy ceramic mug, the same kind issued at Camp Lejeune decades ago. The aftertaste of cinnamon lingered faintly. He'd boiled sticks in water the night before, just like Ruth used to do when fall crept in. Out on the street, things looked perfectly ordinary, if overly precise. Flags had appeared on lawns, exactly 12 inches tall, staked at precisely the 3-foot boundary from sidewalks. Bird feeders were rearranged to avoid visual clutter. One house had removed its fall wreath and replaced it with a single orange leaf pinned flat to the door with a paperclip. It wasn't protest in the traditional sense. No signs. No yelling. Just eerie, pristine compliance. So pristine it was unmistakably intentional. Walt stepped outside, jacket zipped halfway, and made his way toward the backyard with Benji, who'd shown up 10 minutes prior with a duffel bag full of laminated pages. "They're perfect," Walt said, leafing through them. Each page displayed a clause from the HOA handbook in large, readable font, highlighted and footnoted. "Let's hit the boards." Together they walked the blocks, Benji on skateboard, Walt on foot with his slight limp. At each corner post, each shaded kiosk, they pinned one copy. No commentary, no complaint. Just the rules, verbatim, served cold. At Maple and 2nd, Mrs. Rinaldi waved as she gently watered a single-potted mum. Her granddaughter sat on the porch, drawing on a sketchpad this time instead of sidewalk chalk. Across the street, Mr. Gaines adjusted his mailbox to match the exact tilt specified in the HOA handbook. It took him 3 tries with a spirit level, but he gave Walt a thumbs up when he finally got it. The effect was both amusing and quietly powerful. Residents greeted one another with knowing winks. "HOA happy today," someone muttered as they passed. "Compliant as can be," came the reply. By early afternoon, Deborah's walks had grown faster. She paused at each house, visibly agitated. Once, she snapped a photo of a flagpole and zoomed in, then scrolled her phone furiously. But nothing she saw violated any rule, at least not the letter of it. That evening, just as Walt finished writing a new entry in his logbook, October 3rd, community compliance trending, he heard a rustle at the front door. The clock read 11:45 p.m. A soft scuff, then the flap of something being pushed under. Walt waited a few seconds, then opened the door. No one in sight. On the mat, an unsealed envelope marked, "Notice, Community Disruption." It bore the HOA header but no time stamp, no date filed. He bent down, picked it up, then looked at the camera he had hidden just above the porch light. Next morning, Benji came over early. Together they reviewed the footage, Deborah in a pale hoodie, slipping the letter under the door at 11:45 p.m. Walt didn't say much, he just tapped the clock visible in the frame and nodded once. "I can upload it if you want," Benji offered, already opening the town's private neighborhood page on his phone. "Keep it simple," Walt said. "Just the clip, no comments." Within an hour, the video was quietly making rounds, shared in group chats, whispered about over garden fences. There was no need for outrage. The footage spoke for itself. That same afternoon, something else started happening. The HOA website, normally quiet except for fee reminders, was flooded with requests. Dozens of residents submitted polite but pointed questions. Was it true that citations required daytime delivery? Had Deborah followed Clause 4.2b regarding notice duration? Could they request an audit of the last 10 fines? It wasn't a revolt. It was paperwork. Lots and lots of it. Walt sat on his porch that evening, flipping through the dog-eared handbook, the sunset gilding the quiet street in orange and gold. From time to time, a neighbor would pass and nod. Some smiled. One left a plate of banana bread without a word. At 6:02 p.m., his flip phone buzzed. A new message popped into view, a single screenshot of an email header, sent from HOA@newfield.gov. Subject, Emergency HOA Meeting, Attendance Mandatory. By the time the chairs were set up in the rec center, Deborah had already called the sheriff. The room smelled faintly of pine sol and anxious sweat, the overhead fluorescents buzzing louder than the whispering crowd. Rows of folding chairs scraped against the linoleum as neighbors shuffled in, some with thermoses, others with wrinkled petitions clutched in weathered hands. The Wednesday wind howled faintly against the windows, and with each gust, the American flag on the corner pole flapped like it, too, was irritated. Walt Rourke stepped inside quietly, holding the door for Mrs. Rinaldi and Benji's dad. He wore his Sunday flannel, maroon with pearl buttons, and walked with a calm that belied the storm circling the neighborhood these past weeks. His old boots tapped steadily toward a seat near the front. When he passed the sheriff, he gave a curt nod. Sheriff Tolan, sipping from a dented thermos labeled "Trust the Law," nodded back without a word. At exactly 6 o'clock, Deborah Langley stood, arms folded, lips pursed like she'd tasted something sour. She tapped the mic and cleared her throat. This emergency HOA meeting has been called due to escalating disruptions and coordinated non-compliance that threaten the integrity of our community standards. Murmurs rippled. A few eyes rolled. Walt folded his arms across his chest. Some individuals, Deborah continued, glaring in Walt's direction, have taken it upon themselves to reinterpret regulations, post unauthorized notices, and encourage civil disobedience. Walt didn't flinch. When she paused dramatically, he slowly stood. With respect, I believe a community built on silence and fear is more dangerous than one built on questions, he said. Gasps from the back. Someone whispered, "Here we go." I have here, Walt continued, pulling a neat folder from his coat pocket, a record of all notices issued by the HOA this past month. 7 lacked appropriate lead time. 3 were delivered outside acceptable hours. He placed a photocopy of the bylaws on the table beside him. I also have a time-stamped recording of a notice being slipped under my door at 11:45 p.m., not 24 hours in advance as Article 4, Section C requires. Sheriff Tolan shifted in his chair. I've reviewed that footage, he said, not unkindly. It doesn't violate any criminal statute, but it's definitely pushing the line. Deborah's lips twitched. This isn't a court of law. It's about order. Mrs. Rinaldi stood slowly, hands clasped in front of her. Order isn't the same as fairness. You fined my granddaughter for drawing hearts on the sidewalk. You said it was defacement. She's 6. A few nods. One man coughed loudly and muttered, "My porch flag cost me $50 in citations." Deborah's voice cracked, but she pressed on. The board will decide how to proceed. I will not be intimidated. Walt took a breath, stepped forward again, and laid another folder on the table. This, he said, is a petition. Signed by 22 households. Not a protest, just a formal request for financial transparency and independent oversight of board decisions. He slid the notarized document across the table gently, as though it might sting her if he moved too quickly. For a moment, silence. Then came the creak of the back door. Lily, violin case in hand, stood in the hallway just outside the open frame, her wide eyes locked on the exchange. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Deborah's eyes flickered toward the petition, then back to Walt. As the meeting wound down, people shuffled their papers, shrugged on coats, and left in quiet pairs. The energy had shifted. It wasn't firebrand rebellion, but it was heavier than grumbling. It was momentum. Deborah lingered behind, stacking her own papers with stiff fingers. As Walt passed her on his way out, she leaned in, low and sharp. Let's see what the board says about this. On Friday morning, 3 black SUVs parked diagonally across Walt's driveway, and didn't budge. Walt blinked through the kitchen window, cider in hand, steam fading into the cool air. He'd seen some odd things during his years in the Corps, but this was a new flavor of absurd. The vehicles were matte black, no insignia, no license plates in view. Just large, quiet machines blocking every exit from his gravel driveway. A man in a windbreaker with the word "compliance" stitched in pale thread stood with arms crossed in front of the hood. Another paced slowly with a clipboard. Walt didn't move. He took another sip of the lukewarm cider, then opened the screen door and stepped onto his porch. It creaked under his boots like it always had, faithful and loud. "You gentlemen lost?" he asked, voice steady. The man with the clipboard didn't look up. Temporary security assessment. Please stay inside. Under whose authority? A slight pause. Community Enforcement Division. Never heard of it, Walt said, squinting. And I've read every page of the bylaws, twice. From down the street, a bicycle tire crunched on gravel. Benji skidded to a halt behind a hedge, phone already in hand. He didn't speak, but the angle of the lens told Walt everything. He was streaming. Within minutes, shapes began to appear on the sidewalks. Mrs. Rinaldi stood in her robe near her fence. A plumber's van pulled over with its hazard lights on. Lily tiptoed past with her violin case, placing something small and orange near Walt's porch step, a pumpkin, later he'd see, painted with soft blue letters, "Thank you." Walt stood tall. His flannel jacket fluttered in the breeze like a banner. At 10:42 a.m., Deborah Langley arrived, heels clicking on the pavement like metronomes of irritation. She wore a crisp blazer and a faint smile, the kind that came from expecting to win. "I trust you're cooperating," she said, not quite looking at him. "I'm standing on my own porch." "You've violated the architectural uniformity clause. That broken fence panel," she pointed, "creates visible disorder. The board has authorized temporary site control." "That true?" Walt asked, glancing at the man still holding the clipboard. Before he could respond, a voice cut in. "Mind if I ask a few questions, Ms. Langley?" Everyone turned. A woman in a corduroy coat stood beside the mailbox, holding a press badge that read Newfield Gazette. Rinaldi stood behind her, beaming with the innocence of plausible deniability. "Journalist?" Deborah blinked. "Local. Covering community governance. I heard there was unusual enforcement happening." Deborah stiffened. "Private matter. Board sanctioned." Walt's eyes locked briefly with the HOA vice president, a tall man in a tan windbreaker who had appeared near the sidewalk. He shook his head ever so slightly, and mouthed, "Not us." Walt nodded slowly. He pulled a sealed manila envelope from his jacket pocket. "This," he said, "is a request for injunction. Filed this morning with county mediation, reviewed by a legal liaison from the Vets Assistance Center." He handed it to Deborah. She took it without a word, tearing the seal too quickly. Before she could speak, the journalist raised her voice. "Ms. Langley, is it true you bypassed board approval for this action?" Deborah Langley had always controlled the HOA, until the HOA turned around and questioned who gave her the right. The small flag still fluttered that morning, clipped to mailboxes and porch rails like gentle whispers. Walt noticed a few more had appeared since yesterday. Someone had added one to the railing at the diner, just under the specials chalkboard. He sat at the corner booth with a folded letter in his pocket and a calm sip of coffee in hand. The confirmation from the county judge came with little flourish. His injunction request had been accepted for preliminary review. No action would be taken until a full hearing, but the wheels were moving. That was enough. Mrs. Rinaldi slid into the booth opposite him with a proud grin and a plastic bag of oatmeal cookies. "For stamina," she said. "I heard the meeting might be long." Walt only smiled. At 3 o'clock, the board gathered at the HOA office, a narrow space wedged between the insurance broker and a closed-down ice cream parlor. The room smelled faintly of old toner and vanilla candles. Folding chairs lined up like pews, and residents slowly filled them, whispering under their breath. Deborah entered precisely at 3:01, her hair swept high and a pearl necklace tight around her throat. She greeted no one. Walt stood near the back, flanked by Benji's father and the vice president of the HOA, Carl Enright. The meeting began with formality. Deborah read from a clipboard, citing recent disorder and undermining of HOA integrity. But before her third bullet point, Carl gently raised a hand. "Madam President," he said, voice even. "Before we proceed, I'd like to bring attention to a motion filed with the county. Several residents received notice." Deborah blinked. "That's not board business." "On the contrary," Carl replied, unfolding a printed document. "It concerns procedure, specifically your authorization of compliance visits and temporary security assessments." Murmurs broke out. Walt remained still. Carl continued, "You enacted new enforcement measures last month, citing emergency authority. Yet there's no record of a formal vote or notification to the board." Deborah's voice rose a notch. "There were extenuating circumstances." Walt stepped forward and handed Carl a folder. Inside were copies of time-stamped videos, images of citations, the format errors, and most damningly, a sworn letter from Lily's parents detailing the incident where Deborah reprimanded the child for disruptive violin sounds. It was signed, dated, and notarized. The journalist from the Newfield Gazette stood quietly in the corner, phone in hand, recording with practiced discretion. "What's more," Walt said softly, "the board email logs show no shared correspondence for these changes. I cross-checked with the bylaws again this morning." Carl looked up. "That aligns with what we found." Deborah's breath quickened. Her eyes darted from face to face, searching for support. There was none. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "You people think just because you have porches and pie socials you can run a neighborhood? You wouldn't last a month without standards." Several gasps fluttered across the room. "You want chaos," she shouted. "Unmowed lawns? Flags and chalk and garbage cans left out an hour too long?" Her voice cracked. The pearls around her neck snapped, one thread giving way to age or stress or both, and scattered across the tile floor. A few rolled under the plastic chairs. Deborah didn't move to retrieve them. The journalist didn't pause the recording. In the back row, Benji knelt beside Lily, gently helping her tighten the fine tuners on her violin. She played no notes. Not yet. The room fell still. Walt waited a breath, then turned to Carl and the rest of the board. "Would it be alright if we turned that vacant lot into community parking, for free?" 2 months later, what used to be a dusty, empty plot of HOA-controlled land was now full of laughter, lawn chairs, and light jazz. The breeze was crisp that December morning, carrying with the scent of cinnamon pine cones and kettle corn. Where once stood a cracked, weed-riddled lot now rose simple benches made of salvaged wood, strings of white lights strung from pole to pole, and a small stage nestled between 2 holly bushes. A paper sign taped to one light post read, in a child's handwriting, "No parking rules today." Walt stood just outside the low picket border, hands tucked into the pockets of his worn coat. The scarf around his neck had frayed at the edges, a faded marine emblem just visible at the corner. He sipped warm cider from a tin mug, the kind he'd used camping with Helen years ago. It tasted of apples, cloves, and something close to contentment. The injunction had been finalized 2 weeks earlier. Deborah's name no longer appeared on any official HOA correspondence. She hadn't been seen since the board accepted her quiet resignation with a note citing personal stress. There were no charges filed, Walt hadn't pressed for any. The real victory, he believed, was that her power dissolved without spectacle. That seemed fitting. A mild-mannered former librarian named Lois took the helm as interim president. She mostly nodded during meetings and had already sent out a suggestion box printed on recycled paper. Walt had declined the invitation to join the board, gently suggesting, maybe someone who listens more than they talk ought to be up there. Today, the town was gathered not for protest, but celebration. A holiday market spilled over the gravel lot, with retirees handing out peanut brittle and wax paper squares and teenagers selling hot cocoa for their band fund. Benji wore a red knit hat and tried to wrangle his granddad's old cassette player to cooperate with the stage speakers. Lily, poised in her blue coat, stood waiting with her violin tucked beneath her chin, bow at the ready. Mrs. Rinaldi waved from the pie table, a plastic snowflake pinned to her lapel. She pointed to a banner hung above the stage, "Neighbors first, rules second." Walt raised his mug in silent agreement. Then, a quiet voice called to him from his left. "Mr. Rourke?" It was the vice president, Carl, holding a small box wrapped in newspaper. "From all of us," he said simply. Inside lay a wooden plaque, hand-sanded, with a brass plate etched in cursive. "Thank you for reminding us of what rules were made for." Walt touched the edge with his thumb, then placed the plaque on the bench beside him. On the stage, Benji gave a thumbs up, and Lily drew her first note. She played America the Beautiful, slow and clear. The melody floated across the lot, touching every folded arm, every old soldier's eye, every child swaying in a hand-knit scarf. As the final note hung in the air, the stage lights flickered to life, warm, golden, and steady. People clapped gently. Some wiped their cheeks without comment. Walt stood in the center of the lot, not saying a word, just watching as the lights caught in the windows of the diner across the street. He thought of Helen, and the truck, and the notepad still resting by the window back home. A soft tug at his coat. He looked down to see a boy of maybe 7, eyes wide, cheeks pink from the cold. "Are you the guy who made parking free?" Walt smiled, slow and deep. "No," he said. "That was all of us." The little town of Newfield didn't change overnight, but something in its rhythm did. Where fear and silence once lingered, neighbors now shared stories, laughter, and the quiet pride of having stood together. When power is unchecked, even the smallest rule can become a weapon. But when a community leans on fairness and each other, it finds something stronger than control, it finds its voice. Perhaps, in a world full of fine print and gatekeepers, the Real safeguard is a front porch light left on, for everyone.